Welcome to the setup video for the Janome JC3 series robots. This video is meant to be supplemental to the JC3 setup manual. Do not assemble Janome robots without following detailed instructions directly from the manual. To begin, familiarize yourself with the part naming and coordinate conventions in section 1.1 of the JC3 setup manual. In this video, we will assemble a 3-axis double-sided type. When you receive your Janome robot, unbox and organize the components per the parts list for your specific robot listed in section 2 of the setup manual. Each robot build will begin with a base. Common configurations include mounting directly to a plate or mounting to support rails, as in this example. The mounting surface should be machined with through holes for each of the mounting screws. Attach the X slider and X support guide with M5 bolts loosely fastened through the bottom. The number of bolts and length of bolts will depend on your specific setup. When all bolts are attached, gently shake the rails to check for a loose fit. Gather the parts to attach brackets B2 and C2 shown here. Assemble spring washers concave side down onto the M5 hex socket bolts. Attach bracket C2 with 2 pins and 4 M5 by 10 hex socket bolts with washers. Torque the M5 bolts to 5 Newton meters. Attach bracket B2 with 2 pins and 4 M5 by 18 hex socket bolts with washers. Torque each of the M5 bolts to 5 Newton meters. Gather the parts to attach brackets B and C shown here. Attach bracket C with 4 M5 by 10 hex socket bolts with washers. Torque each to 5 Newton meters. Loosely attach bracket B with 4 M5 by 18 bolts with washers. Check the loose fit. To attach bracket A, match up the machine surfaces by lowering bracket A until bracket B2 fits into the machined groove. Next, slide bracket A to the right until it sits against the registration edge. Repeat the method for the other side by lowering bracket A until bracket B fits into the machined groove and slide it into the registration edge. If B does not sit against the registration edge, remove it and adjust bracket C to try again. From the back side of bracket B2, fasten 2 M5 by 35 bolts with washers into the bottom row and 2 M5 by 25 bolts with washers into the top row. From the back side of bracket B, fasten 2 M5 by 35 bolts with washers into the bottom row and 2 M5 by 25 bolts with washers into the top row. Torque bracket A to bracket B and B2 to 5 Newton meters, not shown. Torque each of the M5 by 18 bolts holding bracket B to 5 Newton meters. Remove the covers from the X-slider and X-guide rails. If you will be reshipping the robot, let the covers hang off the side for later reattachment. Using your hands, gently slide the X-axis for visual and auditory inspection. The X-slider and guide should move smoothly with no binding. If it does not, ensure bracket A is seated correctly into each bracket B and B2. On the X-slider rail side, use the following tightening pattern to torque down the M5 bolts to 5 Newton meters. As before, check the X-axis movement by hand. If binding occurs, loosen and adjust the recently tightened X-slider bolts. On the X-guide rail side, follow a similar tightening pattern to torque down the M5 bolts to 5 Newton meters. Check the X-axis movement as before. If binding occurs, loosen and adjust the recently tightened X-guide bolts. If binding still occurs, loosen X-guide bolts and repeat X-slider adjustment. Iterate as needed. Gather the parts to assemble the Y-slider shown here. The longer M5 by 45 bolts are packaged in the box with a slider and will go in through the front. The M5 by 10 bolts go in through the back. Begin by inserting the pins and lightly tapping with a hammer until they protrude by 3 millimeters. The pins rest on the side of the linear guide in the hole indicated here. Attach the Y-slider. Fasten the M5 by 10 screws through the back. The number of bolts will depend on the size of the robot. 6 screws in this case for the 500mm Y-stroke. Loosely fasten the M5 by 45 bolts through the front, two on each side. Torque down the M5 by 10 bolts from the back in the following pattern to 5 Newton meters. Next, torque down the M5 by 45 bolts from the front. Gather the parts to assemble the YZ mounting bracket shown here. Insert positioning pins into the Y-slider table. Position the YZ mounting bracket. Fasten 4 M4 by 10 bolts through the front. Torque down to 2.4 Newton meters. Please note, this torque spec is a unique value. Do not over-torque. Gather the parts to assemble the Z-slider shown here. Insert positioning pins into the YZ mounting bracket. Attach the Z-slider and fasten 4 M5 by 45 bolts. These bolts are also packaged in the box with the slider. Fasten M5x8 bolts through the back of the YZ mounting bracket. The number of bolts will depend on the size of the Z slider, 2 in this case for the 200mm Z stroke. Make sure the Z slider is pushed up against the locating pins in the YZ mounting bracket as you torque down to 5 Nm. Torque the back bolts as well, not shown. Gather the parts to assemble the Z connector mounting plate. Fasten 4 M4x10 Phillips head screws as shown. Gather the parts to assemble the Y connector mounting plate as shown. From the Y-axis motor side, slide 2 M5 nuts into the B2 bracket T-slot as shown. Tighten the M5 socket head bolts. Attach the coated clip to the Y connector mounting plate with an M4x6 screw. Gather the parts to assemble the nylon clips. From the X-guide rail side, slide 2 M4 nuts into the A bracket T-slot as shown. Fasten 2 nylon clips with M4x6 screws and slide them to the side for later use. Gather the parts for the Y-axis cable vare bracket. Attach the cable vare bracket for the Y-axis cable vare to the Z connector mounting plate. Similarly, attach the cable vare bracket for the X-axis cable vare to the Y connector mounting plate. Gather the parts to assemble the Y-axis cable vare bracket. From the X-guide rail side, slide 2 M4 nuts into the A bracket T-slot as shown. Attach the cable vare bracket for the Y-axis cable vare to the A bracket. Remove the cover from the Y slider. If you will be reshipping the robot, let the cover hang down for later reattachment. By hand, slide the Y-axis to check the cable vare placement. Leave it unclipped for later cable insertion. The X-axis cable vare support is an optional item and not part of the main robot parts list. Gather the parts to assemble the X-axis cable vare bracket. Attach the cable vare bracket for the Y-axis cable vare to the X-axis cable vare support. Gather the parts for the X motor connector mounting plate. Attach the coated clip to the X motor connector mounting plate with an M4x6 screw. The X motor connector mounting plate can be mounted in multiple locations. In this case, it's mounted on the aluminum extrusion supporting the X slider rail. Connect the X motor connector. Gather the parts for the Z motor and brake cables. Attach the Z brake cable connector to the Z connector mounting plate. Fasten the grounding wire with the M4x5 screw and toothed washer. Attach the Z motor cable connector to the Z connector mounting plate. Connect the motor side of the cables. Zip tie the Z motor and Z brake cables to the cable vare bracket. Fill the Y-axis cable vare with the Z cables. Remove slack and connect it. Add zip ties to the other CableVayer bracket as before. Use the nylon clips for additional cable management. Gather the Y motor cable. Attach the Y motor cable connector to the Y connector mounting plate. Connect the motor side of the cable and use the coated clip for cable management. Fill the X-axis CableVayer with the Y and Z cables and connect it. Add zip ties as before. Gather the X motor cable. Attach the X motor cable connector to the X connector mounting plate. Use the coated clip for cable management. Connect the motor side of the cable. You have now completed the JC3 Cartesian robot assembly.